So by 1774, tensions between many of these colonial tax protesters and Britain um, was becoming quite intense, and we'll see that eventually this will lead to a conflict between these protesters, who will eventually become known to us today as the Patriots, and the British. And the big question we're going to be looking at in this section is, how in the world is it that the Patriots win? We're going to see that there are going to be a number of factors stacked up against a Patriot victory. So we might well wonder what in the world happened that led to the defeat of the British Army in the Revolutionary War. So in 1775, tensions were quite high in Boston. The port of Boston was still closed because of the Intolerable Acts, and General Gage, who was the commanding officer in charge of British forces in Boston, had a network of spies who had alerted him to a stockpile of ammunition and firearms that were being kept in the town of Concord. And so in April of 1775, Gage gave the order for British troops to march out west and take the supplies, arrest some of the ringleaders, but it didn't go very well. At the town of Lexington, the British regulars who were marching west encountered a militia. The militia had been alerted ahead of time that the British were coming, and they met on the village green, and they sort of had a tense moment where they watched each other and didn't do anything until somebody fired a shot. After the shot had been fired, the British fired a volley into the Lexington militia. Several of them were killed, the rest of them ran away, and the British marched on to Concord. By the time they got to Concord, they didn't find much. They burned some of the supplies. They couldn't find the ringleaders because word had already reached the area that the British were going to be coming there soon. But along their way back to Boston, they were met along the way by a number of individuals who were taking pot shots from the woods and hills, and a number of British casualties resulted. Now, as your reading is going to indicate from after the fact, for about the next year of the conflict, the war will be raging. Now this Continental Congress that had been organizing the protests and the unified colonial response to these British laws is now also going to be organizing the war effort and trying to make it that the Patriot side is going to win. But it wasn't until July of 1776, over a year later, that these protesters morphed into a movement of independence. That they were no longer seeking to express their anger over what they regarded as unequal British taxes, but were instead now arguing in favor of independence. And your reading is going to talk about, one, the ideas behind the Declaration of Independence, but also the events of 1775, including the infamous Lord Dunmore Proclamation in Virginia that tended to push these protesters over the edge towards independence. Now, once independence is declared, it's certainly not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination that the British are going to lose and that the Patriots are going to win. There are a number of factors stacked up against the Patriots that would indicate why they should not be winning this conflict. Britain had just had this amazing success in the 7 Years' War. One could make a convincing argument that they had the most powerful navy in the globe at this point. Certainly their military had come off quite favorably compared to the French, and they were facing off against a group of colonists whom Britain outnumbered by a ratio of 20 to 1. In addition to that, the Patriots were not even a unified group. Colonial North America as a whole, much later, the second president of the United States, a member of the Patriot movement in 1776, a fellow named John Adams, reflected on 1776 and said, basically, you could divide the colonists into thirds. About a third of the colonists supported independence, about a third supported neutrality, and about a third were loyalist. Historians have since kind of revised those numbers a little bit. The group of neutral people seems to be a little bit larger. The loyalists maybe a little bit smaller. The Patriots about right. But overall, the impression we get is, one, a bunch of colonists who really did not have much of a military at the time. There's certainly a lot of militias, but not any sort of formal military training for most colonists. They're outnumbered, and the colonists as a whole are internally divided. A number of those colonists actually want to stay within the British Empire and are going to fight in this revolution to accomplish that end. So what in the world is going on here? How are these patriots going to be successful? One problem for the British is that it takes them quite a while to figure out what kind of war it is that they're fighting in the Revolution. Until Boston Falls in 1776, the British regarded this as a policing action and are going to be trying to arrest some rabble-rousers, but otherwise not treating this as a regular war. And for the next 2 years of the war, until the war turns to the south from the invasion of New York in 1776 until the collapse at Saratoga, the British are going to regard this conflict as a traditional European-style conflict in which they're trying to create a major defeat for the army in the field. They're going to try and capture strategic sites to push the Patriots to the negotiating table. The problem with this plan, however, is that there really was no room for negotiation. When it came to traditional European-style conflicts, if one side or the other was beaten, then one side would go to the negotiating table. They might trade a few possessions and call it a day. But in this conflict, there's really no room for compromise. Either the colonies are independent or they're not. What the British really needed to do was prevent the protesters, these now independence movement people, the Patriots, from being able to keep an army in the field. As long as the army remained in the field, the hope of Patriot independence remained. It wasn't until the war turned to the South, when it adopted a much more brutal, a much more of a civil war kind of an aspect to it, that the British really understood what it would take to achieve victory. And so perhaps part of the problem for the British is that it just took them several years to figure out what kind of war it was that they needed to fight, and maybe by the time they figured it out in 1778, it was perhaps already too late. There are some other problems facing the British. One of them is the terribly long supply line that the British are going to have to rely upon. The way to get reinforcements is across the ocean. Shipping is slow in this day and age. It can take up to 2 months for a sailing ship to sail from London to the colonies. And the reality is that kind of a time frame is going to be a real challenge when it comes to getting reinforcements. If you're in a real pinch and you need reinforcements right away, 2 months is going to be an awfully long time to wait. Another problem for the British is that the colonies are just geographically huge, and European armies in this day and age were not all that terribly big. It's not going to be until the Napoleonic era, a couple decades later, that we're going to see European armies become 100,000 people kind of armies. Instead, in the 7 Years' War and as well in the American Revolution, the tendency of the British is to rely upon smaller, highly trained military forces rather than very large military forces. And so how do you occupy a territory that stretches from Maine in the north, or Maine was then part of Massachusetts, but from what is now Maine in the north down to Georgia in the south, and force the people of that region to recognize their place within the British Empire? It's just an impossible feat. So maybe just the geographical size of the place is just a limitation to the ability of the British to be able to win here. Another possible explanation is that the British never fully take advantage of the main flaw socially within the British colonies, which was the existence of slavery. Britain, as you've read about before, recognized that it was a militarily precarious situation to have a large population of slaves living within the colonies. Many of those slaves obviously did not care for their masters very much, and perhaps the British could have won had they made it an explicit policy of the British Empire to offer freedom to slaves in exchange for their service in the British Army. This may have worked in the colonial South, at least, and places like South Carolina, where the enslaved population constituted roughly 2/3 of the colonial population there. But the British, for several reasons, don't adopt this. One reason is that the fear is that if they do this and make it a clear colonial policy and not just the field arrangements of various British commanders, then perhaps this might antagonize colonists in places like Jamaica. Jamaica, small as it is, brought in a lot more money into the British Empire because of the benefits of sugar than a place like Pennsylvania. So maybe if they offered freedom to slaves in the South, then perhaps they might keep South Carolina, but perhaps lose Jamaica. There's also the problem for some British folks that maybe independence isn't so bad. Public opinion in Britain is pretty divided over the American Revolution as a whole. There weren't a whole lot of people who said, yes, the colonists ought to be independent, but there were a lot of people who said maybe those protesters had something of a point. Maybe the complaints they have are not as absurd as the Crown and most members of Parliament suggested. And there are certainly some members of Parliament who suggest it would be better for the colonists to be independent than to so completely ravage the economy of places like South Carolina that it would not be productive again for decades. The feeling was that perhaps if the colonists are independent, then they can deal with the headache of administering themselves. They're kind of crazy anyway. Let them deal with the headache of administering their own government. That won't prevent them from really benefiting the British Empire. Some people were already recognizing that the real benefit that Britain derived from its colonies was not in the pleasure of being able to administer them, but instead because they were able to buy their cheap natural resources and sell them British manufactures. And some people argued, would this relationship necessarily come to an end with American independence? That British merchants could still sell them British manufactured goods and make a nice tidy profit for themselves, even if South Carolina were independent. But they argued, if a slave insurrection is encouraged in a place like South Carolina, and the economy is completely destroyed, then that economic relationship might not be restored for decades. So we'll see as we march forward that when it comes to the American Civil War, the Union offering freedom to slaves in the end proved a critical shift that allowed for a Union victory and perhaps explains how the United States was able to win that conflict in the Civil War against the Confederacy. And perhaps it might be suggested that the failure of the British to offer a similar policy to the slaves living in the southern colonies may have helped to explain why at least Britain was not able to hold on to places like South Carolina and Virginia. Now we can divide the war into three phases, as I've already suggested. The first phase comes to an end in March of 1776. What happened there is that Patriots had captured the relatively inconsequential fort of Fort Ticonderoga. The fort itself was not incredibly important, but what was important in Fort Ticonderoga was that it had heavy artillery. The Patriots took the cannon that they had captured in Fort Ticonderoga, dragged it through the snow down to Boston, and so one morning General Gage woke up to see a ring of artillery pieces pointed down into the city of Boston. He didn't know if the Patriots would fire on Boston itself, but he did know that if they chose to do so, then he wouldn't be able to hold his position, and so he felt forced to evacuate up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. After that, the British decide upon a three-pronged assault in what is now, I guess, the United States. The British still regarded it as their colonies, through New York. The plan appears to have been to divide New England, the region east of New York, from the rest of the colonies. Many back in London felt as though New England was the epicenter of all the unrest. They felt perhaps if they sealed off New England from the rest of the colonies, then maybe they could deal with New England by itself and they wouldn't be able to communicate with the rest of the colonies and the rebellion would fizzle out everywhere else. So they plan a three-pronged assault. One assault is going to be led by General John Burgoyne down from British Canada along Lake Champlain. Another assault is going to be led north by the replacement of Gage, General Howe, up the Hudson River Valley. And another prong is going to be led by a general named St. Leger, who's going to draw upon a number of Britain's native allies from the west. And they're all going to meet together somewhere in the region around where Albany is. The problem here is a couple. One, that these three-pronged assaults are going to be complicated. Communication in this day and age is not incredibly effective. So once these prongs are launched, it's going to be hard for their commanders to know the fate of the other prongs. Another problem is that Burgoyne and Howe appear to have had something of a rivalry with one another. And we're still not quite sure why he chose to do this. Perhaps it had to do with that rivalry. But Howe elected, instead of in 1777 launching an invasion north, to first sail south with his army and capture the de facto capital of the Patriots, Philadelphia. Perhaps he thought by capturing Philadelphia, he could force the Patriots to the negotiating table. It was serving as the colonial capital. If this were a traditional European-style conflict between two different states, then certainly capturing your opponent's capital would force them to come and negotiate. What Howe didn't realize is that in this movement for American independence, there really was no room for that kind of negotiation. So the capture of Philadelphia goes off well. The Second Continental Congress responded, however, by just simply moving operations somewhere else. They moved to Lancaster, continued as if nothing had changed. The war continued, and capturing the strategic site of Philadelphia really did not amount to a whole hill of beans. So maybe Howe thought he would be ending the war in one fell swoop by capturing Philadelphia, and thus the three-pronged assault would be unimportant. It's not clear, but didn't work. By the time that Howe gets started up the Hudson River Valley, it's already too late. St. Leger's combined native force and British force is defeated at the Battle of Oriskany, and so poor John Burgoyne was left marching around in the woods of upstate New York, looking for the other two prongs that just never got there. Now, the Battle of Saratoga is actually a series of battles that eventually led to the capture of John Burgoyne and his army. So John Burgoyne surrendered, and this is incredibly important for the Patriots because of what this means for recognition of the United States. Up until this point, nations like France would have liked nothing more than to embarrass Britain by allowing Britain's colonies to achieve independence in North America. This would have been just a delicious revenge for the humiliation of the 7 Years' War. But they also didn't want to back a loser, and they were convinced that the United States was going to be a loser. But Saratoga convinced them that maybe that would not be the case. So after the Battle of Saratoga, the French officially recognized the existence of the United States, declare an alliance with the United States, and begin sending soldiers to support the Patriot War effort. After the Battle of Saratoga, the British war effort turns to the south, and it's here where the British war effort finally starts to adopt a strategy that might actually win. What the British do is they tend to distribute their forces broadly across the region into small groups. And the purpose of this is that the small garrisons of soldiers are going to provide military aid to pockets of loyalists who can then combine their efforts together to try and root out the Patriots and prevent them from being able to tyrannize the countryside. And it proves amazingly successful. By the end of 1780, it appears as though the war in the South is all but lost, and perhaps at least the colonies of Georgia, South Carolina, will be reabsorbed into the British Empire and not become part of these new United States. But General Nathanael Greene is going to revolutionize the war effort. He's going to take command of the Patriot Army of the South. He's going to do what appears to be the nonsensical thing and take his already demoralized army, which had just suffered this humiliating defeat at the Battle of Camden under Horatio Gates, and make it even smaller by dividing it in two. What Greene was trying to do, however, was to make his force smaller and thus more mobile and more able to attack these small bands of British soldiers and loyalists who were preventing the Patriots from gaining the loyalties of the countryside. And it worked. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, one of Nathanael Greene's subordinates is able to defeat a combined Loyalist and British force. After this, the commanding British general in the region, Lord Cornwallis, decides he has no choice but to recollect his army back together and make them into one big fighting force to deal with the threat offered by Nathanael Greene. At that point, he's done exactly what Greene hoped he did, which was abandon the countryside. The Patriots filled in the void, and about a year's worth of effort to reconfigure the countryside into support for the British Empire ceases to exist, and it's as if nothing has happened. After that, Greene kind of leads Cornwallis on a wild goose chase in the woods. Greene realized a couple things. He realized, one, that Cornwallis's support came from the coast. This is where his supply lines were able to provide him with reinforcements. And it was also really awful to be serving in the British Army. If you were an officer, things were pretty good, but for an average soldier, the discipline was harsh, the pay was not great, and so Greene knew the longer he could get Cornwallis marching around in the woods away from the coast, the smaller and smaller his army was going to get as more soldiers chose to desert. So on the slide previous to this, there was a picture of the various battles that took place in the South, and you will notice that there were these squiggly lines representing the paths of Greene and Cornwallis after the Battle of Kings Mountain. The squiggly lines are supposed to represent this wild goose chase as Nathanael Greene is letting Cornwallis's army get smaller and smaller and smaller until he finally thinks, and as they meet at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, that he's made Cornwallis's army small enough that maybe he can pull off a victory here. Greene is going to technically lose the battle, but it's something of a Pyrrhic victory for Cornwallis. Greene loses the battle technically because he does not keep the field. He's forced to leave the field to Cornwallis at the end of the engagement, but it's a Pyrrhic victory because Cornwallis, in trying to capture the field and force Greene away, so depleted his resources, so depleted his manpower that he was going to have no choice but to go back to the coast to get reinforcements. At one point in the engagement, for example, Cornwallis saw the line wavering, so he gave his artillery the order to fire into the crowd. His artillery commanders let him know that the artillery pieces would not make much of a distinction between patriots and British soldiers. In other words, he was going to be killing his own men if he fired into the crowd. He told them to do it anyway because it was necessary to win the day. They did. So all that is to say, the casualties were incredibly high for Cornwallis, and he was forced to flee back to the coast. And here is where the British are going to make their key error. Cornwallis eventually goes up into Virginia, settles on the Yorktown Peninsula, and waits for a resupplying force to come and give him reinforcements, more supplies. Washington, who had been laying siege to General Howe's force in New York, knew of this, left a token force to let Howe think that the bulk of the Patriot Army was still outside of New York. Washington then took his army, or most of his army, south to help Greene engage and lay siege to Cornwallis at Yorktown. That resupplying fleet never came. A British fleet was supposed to get there, but a French fleet sailed north and defeated the resupplying mission, and this left Cornwallis with no hope. Eventually, he decides in 1781 to surrender, and at this point, the new Prime Minister, Lord North, is quoted as saying, "Oh God, it's all over." What he meant by that is, there were still British forces in North America, but as the war dragged on for years and years and years, British casualties mounted, the unpopularity of the war continued to grow in Britain, and he knew he was not going to be able to get enough support in Parliament to supply the funding that would be needed to continue the war effort any longer. So technically, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris that ends the war in 1783, did not come for 2 years, but it was basically a foregone conclusion at this point that the war was over and that the United States would be independent in some way. What those borders were going to look like was yet to be hammered out, but independence is assured after the Battle of Yorktown.